Okay, so here's the thing. I've been hearing a lot of people suggest that summertime might be the best time to plan your next Walt Disney World vacation. And you know, I've got some thoughts to share, so that's exactly what we're gonna do. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel and welcome to the Jeep today. I'm running some errands, I'm taking you with me, and I figure we could talk a little bit about this. And before you even say it, no, we're not just talking about how hot it is in Florida during the summer months. There are some other things that I think you need to take into consideration, and we're gonna cover all of them today. But it's time to get going, so get in your seat, buckle up, and let's go. Now, the best place to start this discussion is, of course, at the beginning. So we need to talk about why people think that summertime is the new go-to season for visiting Walt Disney World. And this comes from the thought process that summertime at Disney nowadays isn't as busy as it was in years past. Now, I don't know that this is true. I don't know that it's not true, but we're gonna assume that it is just for the sake of today's discussion. There are still things that we need to talk about though when it comes to what you need to know if you're thinking about going this route. Sorry, I got a little distracted by the car on a trailer here. Be able to see it here in a second. Any gearheads out there that are particularly impressed by this? Wonder where they're headed to. Anyway, so where were we? Okay, some of the things you need to know if you're thinking about going the route of visiting Walt Disney World during the summer months or planning your next Disney vacation during the summer months. So first and foremost, obviously we have to talk about the heat. I said we're not going to get hung up on it, and don't worry, we're not going to. But there's no way we can avoid talking about the heat. I mean, summertime in Florida, it's definitely hot. And that's a lot to deal with for a lot of people. I mean, even people like myself who not only live here, but have lived in a climate like this for a significant amount of time, it can be a lot to manage, especially when you're spending a lot of time in the theme parks. But I mean, that's not really news to anybody, is it, right? Like, we all know that Florida is hot. Another thing in terms of weather that I want to mention before we really move on to some other things I really think you need to know is that we do have hurricane season to deal with here in Florida as well. Of course, hurricane season starts in June and runs through November, so it also runs into that fall time frame. And while hurricanes might not necessarily impact your vacation, they do add an element of uncertainty that I think is a big turnoff for people when it comes to planning their vacation during the summer months. Inclement weather, even if it's not a storm, certainly not a major storm, can still impact flights and it can impact your trip. So I think a lot of people like to steer clear for that reason. If it doesn't bother you, then it's not a big deal at all, but it is something to be aware of if summer is something that you're considering, or a time frame rather that you're considering for your next Disney vacation. Now, like I said, aside from weather, whether we're talking about the heat or hurricanes, there are a number of other things to take into consideration if you're considering planning your next Walt Disney World vacation during the summer months. And right at the top of that list is that just because it might not be peak season for Walt Disney World and we're seeing less crowds and lower prices, maybe more deals running, doesn't necessarily mean that it's not peak season in a different area of the travel industry, which is still going to cost you more. Now, of course, there are always trade-offs whenever it comes to pricing. Sometimes it's going to cost you more to travel during one time than another. You got to do the math for you and your family. But it's important to understand this going in. It might not be a great time to visit Walt Disney World, but it might be a fantastic time to visit somewhere else, and therefore you're going to pay a little bit more to get wherever it is that you're trying to go, whether it's to Disney or back home. Now, before I go any farther, I just want to explain something real quick so we're all on the same page. When I mention peak season, what that means is the time of year when a lot of people tend to travel, at least when we're talking about things like Walt Disney World or other vacation destinations. This might mean anything like summertime, spring break, major holidays. During these times of year, lots of people travel, so those vacation destinations get a bit more crowded, and with business being what it is, prices tend to be higher during these times. Now, the flip side of that coin is often referred to as off-peak season, value season, off-season. These are the times when it's not as common for people to visit for one reason or another. You tend to see lower crowds. You also tend to see deals or lower pricing, or maybe even a combination of both, to entice more people to visit that destination. The suggestion is that summer is becoming that off-peak season here at Walt Disney World. But of course, there are trade-offs. That's part of why I wanted to chat with you about this today. Now, one of the trade-offs of visiting during an off-peak season is that Disney knows it's an off-peak season. They know There's not going to be as many people at the parks, and so they want to take advantage of that. And they're going to get some work done, especially on major attractions during off-peak season. We recently saw this over with Peter Pan's Flight, which just recently opened back up. Test Track's also down right now, though that's going to be an extended closure because they're reimagining the whole thing. Super excited for that, by the way. I'm hoping that it turns out good. But it's important to realize that if you're going to be visiting during an off-peak season, it's more likely than not that you're going to see some work getting done. Now, there's always work being done at Walt Disney World. It's like one big, huge, ongoing project, but I do think it's worth being aware of. If you're wanting the full experience of Walt Disney World, you want to be able to do absolutely everything, you might not want to visit during an off-peak season. But of course, you always want to check the schedule. You always want to see what they're working on and when they do post this information so that you can be aware of it. You don't plan your vacations during a time, when your favorite attraction is going to be closed or whatever the case may be. And look, even if you're not bothered by the fact that attractions are down for maintenance, it's still important to understand that attractions, shops, restaurants are going to be going down for refurbishment or maintenance or updates or whatever the case during these off seasons. And again, it's going to depend on the year, what attraction goes down when, always changes, right? But when these things close down, people have less places to go. And when there are less places for people to go, everything seems more crowded. And this is actually really interesting because I've been hearing a lot of people talk about this. Some of you have even shared some of your thoughts in comments on different discussions that we've had. Things kind of feel really crowded at Walt Disney World, even when they're not supposed to be crowded. And we keep hearing people talk about how this is a low season and how it's not crowded at Disney. So what's going on? The long and short of it, at least in my opinion, is that because there are less places to go, there are less things for people to do, there are less lines for people to have to wait in, there are more people just out and about. And that can have things feeling crowded even if there aren't as many people here. So there's this weird kind of illusion going on. Now, this is something that we've kind of talked about before, and I mention it every now and again, especially when I talk about how Disney hasn't really come back 100% since the pandemic, since everything closed down in 2020. Epcot's actually a really great example of this. We do have the Wonders of Life Pavilion. That's a huge area where people could be. There are attractions in there, a dining location there, activities in there, and it's closed. So where do those people go? They have to go elsewhere within the park. And we get the same type of result when we talk about things like virtual queues and mobile orders. There was a time when you had to stand in line in order to eat your food or to go on certain attractions. Now, because you don't have to stand in a line, you have the option of going elsewhere, and that creates bigger crowds in places where there might not have been crowds before. And you get a very similar result during these off-peak seasons when attractions go down. So over at Magic Kingdom, at least right now, or like I said, I know Peter Pan just opened back up, but a couple days ago when I was there, Peter Pan was down, so people weren't waiting in line for Peter Pan. And the gift shop over at Pirates of the Caribbean is closed, and so that's moved to Tortuga Tavern across the way, but that's not a dining location, so people aren't spending as much time in there as they would if it was the quick service that it normally was, and that means that the crowd control isn't what it normally would be, resulting in it feeling more crowded than it actually is. And sometimes it even results in longer lines or just a less desirable experience overall because there's no place to sit or no place to hang out or there's no shade. Like, these are all problems anyway, but even during an off-peak season, especially if you're expecting it to be less crowded, it might not necessarily feel that way. So the question ultimately becomes, what are you supposed to do with this information? You know what I mean? Like, if you're thinking about planning a Disney vacation during the summer months, should you consider it still? Am I telling you that it's not a good idea? Honestly, as I so often say, it really depends on your wants and needs. See, I in no way want to steer you away from doing what you think is going to be best for you and your family. The whole point of this discussion today is to give you the tools that you need to make a decision that's going to be right for you. Now, when it comes to my personal opinion, do I think that summertime is a good time to visit Walt Disney World? Man, is that going to depend on you and your family and whether or not you are capable of managing the heat here. Because it's all fun and games until you're actually here, sweating like you've never sweat before and experiencing heat that is honestly going to ruin your vacation if you're not ready for it. But to that same point, if this is manageable for you and your family, you've done this before, maybe you're from a place where it gets hot and humid like this, why not? Give it a shot. Just take into consideration some of those things that we've talked about. I also think it's really important to be aware that blanket statements don't do anyone any good. So while some parts of summertime might be off season or low season, other parts simply aren't going to be, especially those major holidays. They're not exempt from the whole it's going to be crowded and expensive thing. So just be aware of that as well. Now, turning back to my personal opinion here, if I was planning a vacation for my family, it wouldn't be during the summertime. And I say that not only as someone who lives here and experiences this heat all the time. I'm in the parks all the time in the heat, but also as someone who did a lot of summertime vacations. As I've mentioned in the past, I worked a teacher schedule for a long time, so did my family. So it was the longest chunk of time that all of us could get off all at one time to do those vacations. Yeah, you can make it work. And if that's the only option for you and your family, you can definitely make it work by doing any number of things. We talk about them here on the channel. But I much prefer slightly cooler weather, fall weather, even into winter. It does get a little chilly here sometimes. I know that some people think that there's no such thing as a cold Florida, but I'll tell you, 40 degrees is pretty chilly here at the most magical place on earth, especially if you're spending all day outside. Like, it can get brisk. But if I had the choice, I don't want to be running around trying to desperately find the next patch of shade or hope with everything that's within me that Spaceship Earth actually has air conditioning today. You know what I mean? Like, that just doesn't seem like fun to me. Doable, manageable sometimes, but not necessarily fun, even if it's a little bit less crowded and a little bit more affordable. But again, that's just my personal preference. Of course, I'd love to know what you guys have to say, so tell me all of your thoughts in a comment down below. If you've ever done a summer vacation here at Walt Disney World, what was your experience like? What worked for you? What didn't? If you're thinking about planning a summertime vacation at Walt Disney World, tell me what's having you consider it. All in a comment down below. But for now, I think it's time to call it a day. Thanks so much for hanging out with me. I know that we didn't really do a ton of adventuring, though I did drive here to the grocery store and I picked up some stuff. By the way, that's a sloth back there, in case any of you were wondering. But yeah, as always, I'm looking forward to hearing what you guys have to say. Hearing all of your experiences really gives not only me, but others some perspective on what to expect, especially for different families and different dynamics, you know, because there are so many of you out there. So I really appreciate you taking the time to share that. But for now, me, my groceries, and the sloth are making our way home. Thanks so much for hanging out with me, and I look forward to seeing you guys next time. Bye.